Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It's a very productive discussions that I think have been going on all day, and I notice that many of the things that people are saying I am also going to say, so that may be a way of reinforcing the message that's going to come across. This is what I want to try and do. A few years ago, I published a brief newspaper article in which I said there were 5 action points to improve the education of ethnic minority students in Hong Kong. And I want to build on that today. I'm going to expand it a little because the purpose of those 5 points was really to secure a better sense of social justice for ethnic minority students. But I also argue it was good for investment for government. I think social justice is very important, but you can always convince governments by talking about a good investment. So we'll try to do 2 of those things. But I really want to focus this afternoon on action, on what can be done as distinct from what we think or what we want to reflect about. Some of what I say, it is not possible for schools to do, as you will see. But much of it is, and if there's one major theme that I would like to come across, it is that schools have a lot of capacity to work in this area, that they don't have to rely on EDB. They can do it themselves. Well, let me start quickly. The first issue around the action plan is a very big issue, and it's about multiculturalism. I think one of the big issues in Hong Kong is that there is no policy on multiculturalism. And yet Hong Kong is a multicultural city, as this conference shows, but you only have to walk around the city to realise that Hong Kong is a multicultural city. Without a policy on multiculturalism, there's no support for the idea that diversity is important. Hong Kong prides itself on being an international city, but importantly, it's a multicultural city, and we need to acknowledge that. Now, the action for this, of course, is the government. I think it's the Equal Opportunities Commission, but also schools. Some of the best schools that are working with ethnic minority students have really good local school policies on multiculturalism. There was, last week, I think one of the Delia schools was Multicultural Week, a whole week of multicultural activities. So schools can do it, and it's great for schools to do it. But there needs to be an overarching policy as well, I think. I also believe, and this is very controversial, that Hong Kong needs racial vilification legislation. I just think that people ought not to be able to be racist. I think there needs to be laws against racism and against saying things about ethnic groups of one kind or another, or even social groups, other groups of Chinese people. It is just not right in a democracy for racial vilification to go on, but not everyone will agree with me on that. But what does all this have to do with education? This is all big stuff. This is what it has to do with education. I think students need a conducive and safe environment in which learning can take place. Free from racism, free from discrimination, where the focus is to learn and not to have to combat these other things. So while it's a big issue and while it's an issue for government, I think it's also an issue that supports learning. The second thing, and this has been said over and over again, but remember I first said this a few years ago, is to develop a school curriculum for non-Chinese speaking students. Now I want to emphasise the word school curriculum, and we've heard EDB people talking today about the importance of schools, and we've heard Ip Kin Yoon talking about, well, why doesn't EDB develop teaching materials, etc. I think we've got to say that the Chinese language curriculum, second language framework, that's all you're going to get. There is no more, people. That's it. Now, if that's it, then we need a lot more, and that capacity must come from schools, I think. Schools must take the initiative to work with higher education staff. We've seen people here today. Dr. Shum was here earlier. We have people at my own institute who do this kind of work. I think schools have to reach out to these people and say, come and help us, come and work with us on issues around second language teaching, because that's the issue. I think also schools need to monitor learning progress of students, and I'm going to talk a little more about that later on in an administrative sense. And it needs to be more than just end of semester testing. It needs to be ongoing formative assessment of learning progress with languages. I also think that teacher education programs must really come to grips with the education of teachers for Chinese language. And if they're not doing enough, then they should be made to do more, so that the new hires, which I think someone talked about earlier today, are ready when they get into schools. If they go to a school where there are ethnic minority students, the new teachers can say, yeah, we know how to do this. Because if they can't, they're not being well prepared. So yeah, I think EDB has a responsibility. I think it's done as much as it's ever going to do. Don't rely on them anymore. Rely on school capacity and build it and develop it. Third area, teacher professional development. Absolutely fundamental, absolutely crucial to provide support for Chinese language teachers. It's all very well to say this is a teacher responsibility, but you've got to support teachers in that responsibility, because it will be new to many teachers. But there is teacher professional development already available. It's not like there is none. EDB does support professional development in this area. Very often, school principals, I don't know if any school principals are here, but school principals need to release teachers to go to these professional development courses. I'm not blaming school principals, by the way, because if the school principal doesn't support the teacher, then they don't get to go. So a lot is with the leadership. There are formal award courses that teachers can do to specialise in this area, and schools can commission professional development. So we can get on with professional development. It can be done, and schools can do it. And I think people may disagree. I think schools actually have the money to do this. It's not something that they don't have. The fourth area, classroom support. But not just for the teaching of Chinese. Classroom support is needed for all academic subjects. I've not heard mention of that today, but in the research that has been done where I am, this becomes a really fundamental area. In mathematics classrooms, in science classrooms, in liberal studies classrooms, in science classrooms, we need to go beyond the teaching of Chinese language. Of course, the teaching of Chinese language is fundamental and basic, but so too are the other subjects. So other subject support is needed. We need teachers and teaching assistants to work together. The idea of teaching assistants, I think, is very important, and it's one that we should put a lot of effort into. And again, resources can come from EDB to do that. But then there is the issue of how teachers and teaching assistants work together. The fifth area, monitoring. Now, this is an area that was not part of the original 5-point plan that I talked about, but research has shown that it's fundamentally important. Research has shown that there are very few records of what happens in our schools, and there's certainly not records that are divided into ethnic minority students' attendance records, ethnic minority students' exit records. They're not there. At least when researchers go to schools, they're not there. And so I think we need a much better system of record keeping within schools, because, let me take that back.
Not too far. 2 minutes.
Because what happens to students is of fundamental importance. I was interested to hear our student before talk about the number of schools. The number of schools that ethnic minority students go to is really very problematic, because some schools don't like to keep them when they're not performing well, so they move on. How many schools do they go to? We don't know. And when you say to a school, could we look at your attendance records? And they say, yes. You can't tell from attendance records because they're not structured according to the ethnicity of the students. Again, this is very controversial. We read in this morning's newspapers, or some people may have, of some of the conditions of poverty that are related to ethnic minority groups in this city. Then we need to make sure that there is no child in Hong Kong who cannot go to school because of the parents' socioeconomic status. The use of cash transfers is a way to do that. It's relatively straightforward because it's always the poorest families that suffer. We've got to make sure that there is equal access to education, and that at kindergarten level and at senior secondary level, students aren't excluded on account of cash. So it's time, and Mark Gray's telling me that it's time, but it's time for action as well. And there are things that the schools can do, there are things that the government must do. I think schools can also share, like this session today, very important sessions, lots of sharing of good ideas and best practice. I think listening to students is really very, very important because you learn so much from the experiences that people have. We can do more of it. On these bigger issues, to add more things to the work of NGOs, lobby the government about policies on multiculturalism, about cash transfers. Put the government on notice that these are the things that need to be done. Let the schools get on and work out the Chinese curriculum and get into lobbying the government on issues that are big and that they can do. Don't rely too much on EDB. They do a good job. They provide money, but don't sit down and say, well, I'm going to wait for EDB. That's not their job and they won't do it. You can do it. Schools can do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kerry. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking this part of the program, we've got particularly educators, but we are convened by the Centre for Comparative and Public Law. You talked about legislation, but on the whole, you seem to be saying legislation is one thing, action is at the school level. You said several times, don't wait for the EDB, you'll be waiting forever. Get on with it, do it at the school level, but particularly I'm hearing teachers and support in the classroom. Now I'm wondering what else you heard. We've got 5 minutes for questions, comments to Kerry. We'll group them, don't answer them all at once. Or you can answer them all at once, but yes, please, madam. Yes. Yes.
Hi, Geeta Bhavnani from PolyU. At present at PolyU, but previously used to be a secondary school teacher. I've heard a lot of suggestions made by Dr. Kennedy, and I would really like to address this issue, which is itching me. Now, I mean, I think secondary schools would benefit, yes, by having loads and loads of teaching assistants, but that is an issue which the EDB has to deal with, somehow or the other, because we keep talking about having more teachers, smaller classrooms, and this has been going on and on and on for years. Something has to be done. Having said that, Dr. Kennedy mentioned something about taking attendance and where the EM students are going. Telling administrators or telling teachers, frontline teachers, to sit down and divide up EM, mainline Chinese students, that's taking away class time. Educators now, from the PolyU side, when I get research funding, when I get funding, I have the time and the money to hire a teacher's assistant to go into a school like Dahlia Memorial, go look through their student cards. Okay, he seems to be from Philippines. Let me look in his data card. And then, as a researcher and having research assistants able to do that. If we give it back to frontline teachers, it's not going to happen. There's a lot more that needs to be done frontline. Letting teachers go on development, I think is a great idea, but again, that comes at a price. From my experience when I was there, my professor, rather my principal was very, very willing to let us go. It was having these conferences at times where I could go. I'm now having exam time, which means I've left my students with someone else so that someone else can do invigilating so I can be here. We require these sort of programs, definitely, but at a time that we can attend. At times that we can attend. Because our priority may be school and then home and whatever. So if these are done on a Saturday afternoon where we don't have class, then we can attend. Those are just a few comments. Thank you.
Valuable comments. Yes, madam.
Yes, Shalini Mitani from the Zubin Foundation. Thank you. That was really that was great what you just shared. I have a quick question. How do we incentivize schools to take the action?
Nice, crisp question. Pooja.
May I just build on that and say, how do you incentivize teachers?
For the translators, how do you incentivize teachers? Any other crisp? Kerry.
Well, I'm not sure I have any crisp responses, but I think the questions are really important. Let me come to the record keeping, because I think it is sinful that this education system does not have a record of how students move from school to school by ethnicity or by social, whether they're mainland Chinese. I don't think teachers should do it. I think administrative assistants should do it. Because it means we just don't know the conditions under which students are learning. Because if they go to 3 different schools in 3 different years, of course they're not going to do very well. So I have a strong feeling about that because I've seen it. All the other things I agree with you on. How do you incentivize schools? Look, we're going to hear from a school leader in a minute, and I don't want to put everything on to school leaders, but all the research on school leadership makes it very clear that when the leadership is there, things happen at another level. They happen to students and they happen to staff. So I think there's a lot of responsibility around leadership. I read a thesis the other day that said school principals spend too much time on strategic planning and not enough time on creating communication and compassion and care in their schools. And then a very sophisticated statistical model happened to show that those 3 variables have the most significant effect on whether teachers learn in schools. So I think I come back to the school principal. I think they're fundamentally important. And
which is a nice transition. Last word from you before we hear from the school principal.
Well, I think I can only repeat that of course schools and teachers can't do everything. I think the big context also has to be looked at. This city cannot any longer be without a policy on multiculturalism. It just can't. If you have that, then our school principals have a broader framework in which to work.
Thank you, Kerry. A clap, hold that, and we'll come back to it.